Sound design can make or break a commercial, but what makes great sound design, and is commercial sound design any different than narrative sound design? I'm going to answer those questions today. My name is Austen Menges, and I've been a pro editor for over 20 years with a focus on broadcast TV commercials with budgets of $100,000 and higher. And today we're going to have a conversation with veteran commercial director, former editor and sound designer, and current co-professor with Oscar-winning actor Matthew McConaughey at the University of Texas at Austen. And today I'm going to ask Scott what his philosophy on sound design is and some creative solutions to sound design that you can start applying to your own edits today. So welcome, Scott Rice.
Thanks for having me, Austin.
So my first question is, what is your overall sound design philosophy, and when do you start thinking about sound for any projects, but in particular commercial projects?
Well, I'll start with the second part of the question. I start thinking about sound design before we even start shooting. So the moment I get a script, I immediately start thinking in pictures, and I draw little thumbnails for what the images and what the shots are. But I also write notes on what the sounds are. So I start thinking about it right away, and I guess that informs my philosophy on sound design, that it's so important. It's how you communicate the story. It's how you communicate the themes. There can be repeated sound effects that might indicate a theme. It can also communicate tone, on and on and on. So sound design for me is really everything. And I think if I could be a sound designer, I'd be a very happy person.
Yeah, exactly, man. I think that's one reason we connect so well, is because we both care so deeply about it. And one thing I want to reiterate to you watching is that we always think of visuals when we're thinking about editing or filmmaking, because it takes so many people and so much gear to go capture a great visual, visual effects and a big camera crew and a crane. But then we have half the experience, which is sound design, and a lot of times it becomes an afterthought. So my message overall with this video, and we're going to talk about some practical ways to make this work and go through this process. We want to take the same care, even though we don't have a 50-person crew and we're burning daylight. We want to take the same care for the sounds, because especially since we go to all that trouble, right, Scott, capturing these incredible images, what a letdown if we don't pair it with just the perfect sound design.
Yeah, sound design is a part of production value, just as much as it is your cinematography, the actors that you cast, the amazing locations that you pick. The quality of the sound design matters. That might be in the quality of the wild sound that you record on set and that the editor then chooses to use, the Foley that is recorded, or the sound effects from the sound effects library or elsewhere that you put into your picture. And you really have to put a lot of thought into it. And in fact, something I learned as an undergraduate student is that, someone who didn't have a lot of money to make my pictures really huge and pretty, I could make my picture seem bigger through the use of a really elaborate, high production value sound design. And that's how I elevated my films when I didn't have the money to do it on set, essentially.
That is great. I would love for you to share a little more on that. There's something you and I both strive for and work toward in our sound design, and I think a good term for it is world building, because obviously budgets are limited, and even on a large budget commercial, there's always going to be compromises, right? There's compromises in the location, what you can show, what you can shoot. Give us some practical tips on how to use sound design. Maybe there's some examples you have, or we can talk about examples. How to use sound design to make the world of your story seem bigger?
Well, there's a few examples. So one is off-screen space. So if you have, a scene at a stadium, but you don't have the money to have 1,000 or more extras, you can build the sound of the extras, and you really imply that this universe has scale, this scene has scale, when it really doesn't. You just shot tight shots in the, in the stadium or auditorium, for example. There's also something you could do to just plus up sound effects.
Oh yeah.
So for
Great.
example, let's say, you and I made a film, an Indiana Jones kind of fan film, and we had spikes coming out of the ground chasing, our child hero. And, what we did was we thought really hard about, okay, we had just the images, visual effects of the spikes popping out of the ground. But the sound made you imagine that there was this whole system, this mechanism under the ground, underneath the earth in this cave. And this mechanism went on for the length of a football field. And it sounded really big and impressive, even though visually you're just seeing the spikes that pop up through the ground. So, and then, there's small sound effects. Me taking a coffee cup and putting it on a desk, we have the audio we recorded of that on the day, but it probably doesn't sound that interesting, or it was a little off mic. Any way to sweeten, sometimes we call sound design sweetening. The idea is we make every little sound just a little bit better. And that's what we want to hear when we go and watch a movie or watch a commercial. We want kind of a heightened reality, not the dull reality that we get in our everyday world.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Scott. And adding to plussing up sounds, I'm going to just throw out a practical tip for comedy. It's often the sound sweetening you do, even with mundane sounds, that will make or break the comedy of the piece. So I remember, Scott, we recently did a commercial where there's a button and there was this huge tragedy. Basically, like this 3D animated dollar bill falls from a ladder and really hurts himself. And the people sitting on the chair, they kind of want to ignore it. And so the guy picks up his drink. They're sitting outside by a pool, and he has sort of this little Mai Tai tropical drink, and he's sort of ignoring it, and he takes a sip. So it's like... And so he might have made a sip sound on set, but I'm not sure. But we had to find just the right slurp sound and put it in the right space for the right length, and until it made us laugh. So I think it's getting into these details that really bring sound to life. And this tees up a question I have for you, Scott, which this video is sort of about, is commercial sound design different than narrative, and what can we pull from narrative to enhance our commercials in terms of sound design?
I think it's not inherently different. So I will start this conversation by saying, anecdotally, I've talked to commercial sound mixers who indicate that a lot of the commercials they do have some sparse sound design, and that may be because the commercial's voiceover based, and they really want the messaging to come through and the voice to come through. But Austen, I think in our work, there really isn't a difference. We really go out of our way to make our commercials sound like movies, have that same production value, and also have that same storytelling. And I think commercials, just like narrative films, can have aural motifs. So sound motifs. So AURAL, aural motifs.
Yes.
And I think that's really key. So whether you're using that for storytelling or character building or exploration of a theme or a message, that's really key. A lot of the commercials we do will start with sort of a sound effect, but then end with the same sound effect or a slightly different version of that sound effect. And the juxtaposition between the two indicates some sort of messaging or some continuation of a theme or an idea. So I think that's really key. Figuring out a way to not only have visual motifs in your film as you're directing, but on the sound side and the editing side, figuring out how to leverage aural motifs as well.
If you don't mind, Scott, I'd like to do a little creative exercise, because this is one of the main things I want you to take away as somebody working on your sound design. I think people are struggling with the idea. Sound design starts with an idea, okay? And so people are asking a lot for kind of a give me a checklist on how to do sound design. And I want to take a step back from there. And I want to, with you, Scott, I want to kind of replicate what we might do in an edit session where we look at a frame. So I'm gonna show a few seconds of this commercial with no sound on. And I want to have a live brainstorm with you on sound ideas that come to mind that we might put in a list, or I might just start, if we were editing live, I might just start looking for and throwing in. But this is how I might start working on a sound design. So just make a creative brainstorm of everything you can imagine sound-wise in the scene that you might want to try before you get bogged down with digging up, trying to find the right sounds, putting them in your timeline. So if you don't mind, Scott, I'm going to mute the commercial. I'm going to play the first few shots, and then I'll go on still frames, and then I kind of just want to riff on what types of sounds we might try. And then at the end of the video, we'll play the final spot and talk a little bit more about how we built this sound design. But here we go.
Great.
Okay, I think that's enough for us to go on. So let's just start with this opening shot. Obviously, this is a very stylized commercial, but what were some things we would probably put on our list to start searching for right away in terms of what you hear, creative ideas?
Right. Well, I want to create this post-apocalyptic sounding world. So
Yes.
whatever in terms of that genre that makes sense, let's start thinking about that. So, for example, there's some kind of low rumble in the background.
Yep.
It's ominous sounding. There's maybe screams happening off screen.
Yep.
So we're implying some kind of off-screen war between these creatures that I don't know. They're spidery. They're maybe from outer space. Maybe this is kind of an alien invasion. I would think that I might also hear like the sounds of the creatures themselves. Yeah, and also possibly some fire. You know, I see some fire.
Yes.
It seems like there's light that might be coming from an off-screen fire. I maybe hear some gunshots. Some kind of battle is going on. Footsteps running, screaming.
Yeah, running away, screaming. Another thing that comes to mind for me with post-apocalyptic are kind of industrial sounds. So I might look up some machine sounds, like maybe some pneumatic kind of hydraulic kind of pumping or some kind of off-screen things. Those are some things
There
that
might
I
be some
try.
tanks. There might be some, more heavy artillery fighting the monsters. So some tank sounds or something could be cool. Absolutely, explosions.
We might imply, talking about world building, we might imply more monsters. So we see one kind of off in the distance.
Yeah.
We might imply that there's some closer to camera. So there might be, and they might make a certain sound. They might be screaming. Those monster sounds, some things we might look for to build that up. We might look for animal screams that we want to maybe pitch shift or layer. Another pro tip is to layer different sounds. Even if you're trying to come up with a single sound, you can use many sounds to do that. So the sound of the spider monster, for instance, it might be a combination of a human scream, an animal scream, a roar, things like that. So I'm going to move on to the next shot. But we definitely have the fire here. So I definitely hear some fire crackling. What do you think, Scott?
Well, and I think that the ambience that we've established continues over this. Maybe kind of dips a little bit. There's going to be some dialogue. I like the idea of the fire and then the footsteps because the camera is close to the boys. He kind of moves into the background toward his dad. So his footsteps should definitely be sweetened.
Yes, good point. I get a sense that it's a little cold because they're wearing big jackets. So we might add something that implies coldness. It could be little wind gusts. Mm-hmm. These are just some things I would try. And then also with their wardrobe, since their wardrobe plays such a big role, I would be really careful to add some cool wardrobe Foley. So I kind of hear the cloth noise when he's moving stuff. And then obviously this spot is about, well, not obviously yet to the viewer, but this is an anti-underage drinking spot. So I might want to draw attention to the bottle. So I might think about, like Scott was talking about, auditory motifs. Maybe we draw attention to the bottle. When he's holding the bottle here, you kind of hear it. Like we kind of go search for a sound of glass on fabric or something like that.
Well, and that's a great point. And sometimes I know what we do is we'll sort of cheat. So we'll say, you know, we need like a bottle clank. And he's wearing gloves, so it wouldn't clank or clink.
Yeah, right.
But maybe there's kind of some metal on his glove or on his wrist that kind of hits it, and you don't think about it. But that little clank that only a beer bottle can make might be a good idea to put in there to draw attention that is indeed a beer bottle.
Yes, and then we, of course, come to this shot, which is a sound designer's dream, because we have a awesome 3D animated spider monster roaring. So obviously that's just fun, finding all the different sounds to get that roar just right. So this is an incredible visual shot. It's worth the hard work of just perfecting what this thing should sound like.
Yeah, and what should it sound like? I mean, again, you know, human sounds combined with animal sounds, combined with other sci-fi sounds. I mean, we're in a sci-fi universe, so genre matters. Yeah. So starting to explore sci-fi sounding things makes sense to sort of put in and experiment with.
Then we, of course, have it fall, and this is a classic sound collection that you're going to be looking at often is impact sounds. Well, depending on what style of commercials you're editing or you aspire to edit, but getting comfortable searching for impact sounds and kind of having key search words that you kind of know are going to pull up some good sounds. So body falls are good. Even though this is a huge monster, you'd be surprised at what you can do by combining all the right different types of impacts. So it might be a crash sound, or a body fall, or the word impact, or mechanical impact. There's a lot of different things you can search for to start building what it might sound like when this monster hits the ground.
And some other details here is that his legs fall at different paces. So I feel like we should have separate sounds as each leg kind of hits and bounces would be great.
Yep.
And if you'll notice, when we shot it, we went out of our way to disturb the fire. So the impact of his body, he's so big, it kind of blows the fire. So the fire could make a little bit of a sound. Even though like in real life, it's kind of like in real life, you blow a fire. It doesn't really make a different noise when it moves. But in movies, whenever a fire blows, it makes noise. It goes, there's like a cool whoosh, fire whoosh associated with that fire moving.
Absolutely. Okay, so this I think was a super fun exercise, and I think the takeaway is this is you got to get into the creative idea of the sound before you start getting into the actual technical work or finding the sound. Take the viewer through the rest of your process, because we might do sound design throughout the editing process over a couple of weeks on a commercial.
So the first process is just to put in some sounds and think of them in terms of what are the wild sounds that we have available. And the editor should search for those wild sounds that were recorded on set, because the director might have thought there was a unique sound that we could only get on set. So don't just ignore those wild sounds and go for your sound effects library. Go through the wild sounds, because those were gotten for a reason. You know, time on set is precious. So if we're recording stuff without camera, picture, and we're recording sounds, they're probably important. So go for those. Start to put in your sound effects, usually from sound libraries. Do some layering, try to make the sounds get a little bit better and better, sweeten the sounds that are the production audio. Again, maybe the coffee set down on the table, you give it a different sound, or footsteps. And usually you do some of that stuff kind of more as you approach picture lock. But getting some of the big, important story information in terms of sound design is important. Like, for example, the sound of that roar. You wouldn't want to show your director this cut without a roar, some kind of roar sound in there, because it'll just fall flat and it won't feel right.
Yes,
The story
exactly.
falls apart and is distracting. And then I would say the ambience. Start to work in the ambience, because that also helps tell a story. So Austen, I think if you had showed me a rough cut of this without some kind of like post-apocalyptic sounds in the background, I might have been distracted, because, you know, this, it has to feel full. Even in a rough cut, I have to have at least some kind of sense of off-screen space and the world and what's going on in the world. The idea that there's other battles going on and there's this hopeless, like really scary environment that these two characters are in. And that actually plays into the theme of the commercial. So it's important to include that, I think, in some of the early cuts.
I like starting with ambiances because this has dialogue. So I want a nice bed of ambiance through the spot so that the dialogue really kind of has somewhere to sit. So I'm going to be thinking, and my first rough cut might be, it's not going to be perfect, but I'm going to try to find some cool industrial post-apocalyptic ambiances. And then I'm going to edit the dialogue, make sure it fits in nice, and you don't hear it come in and out. You know, it's nice and leveled. It's the star of the show, the dialogue. And then I'm going to take a pass. And I'm going to take some initial ideas like from that first brainstorm Scott and I had. I'm going to go search for the monster roar and just kind of my favorite stuff. And I'm just going to kind of rough everything in story-wise. And then Scott and I are going to keep refining it. So every time we go back to edit and refine the edit, we're also refining the sound. So the sound is sort of getting the same treatment in terms of revisions. So by the time we're picture locked, the sound is pretty well locked. And we're talking about sound design. So I think it's time to show the audience where we landed on this sound design, Scott. And then we can talk about it briefly and see. This will probably bring back some memories, you know, on what we ended up doing. But let's let the audience listen to this commercial.
Now, son, be careful there. That's beer. Remember the rules. Rule 1, no underage drinking. 2.
Yeah, I know. Aim for the head. You're not scared of much, are you, Dad?
I'm terrified of underage drinking. Gives me nightmares.
Kids face lots of dangers every day. Make sure alcohol isn't one of them. Set clear rules.
No underage drinking!
Oh man, that brings back good memories.
Yeah, I forgot some things, so that was really fun to see.
So what can you add to your sound design today? Well, I think first and foremost, have a brainstorm session of creative sound ideas before you get into the mess of timelines and searches. Just really let your imagination run wild and write down a list of all your sound ideas. And then my next takeaway, on your next edit, I want you to revise the sound as you're revising picture. So do your first sound design pass with your first rough cut. Then your second rough cut, don't just adjust the visuals, do a whole nother sound design pass and keep doing that. And by your fifth pass, where you're getting closer to picture lock, your sound sort of has evolved into this much more cinematic, layered sound design that's really evoking the emotions that you want. Do that, and you are going to level up your sound design in a big way. Huge thank you to Scott. This was so fun. Blast from the past looking at this old work. And thanks for sharing your perspective as a director in particular as you go through this process. And everybody go follow Scott on Instagram and YouTube. His links are below. And if you enjoyed this video, you should probably check out my free editing guide, which you can download at the link below. And if you want to go deeper than that, also check out my editing course, which has a whole section on sound design where you'll work on a real project and you'll get personal feedback from me. And if you like videos like this, watch this one next. Happy editing.